December 21st of the year 69 AD, Vespasian is officially declared Emperor of Rome. This was the end of one of the Roman civil wars. This one was known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Vespasian lasted 10 years on the throne, and the dynasty he founded, the Flavian dynasty, lasted a total of 27 years. Imperial dynasties in Rome are notoriously short-lived because so many emperors ended up assassinated. And especially in the later years, people recognized the military had the power, so whoever was in charge needed to bribe the army just to stay alive. December 21st, the year 72 AD, this is the date of death for the Apostle Thomas, otherwise known as Doubting Thomas. Yes, we actually know his exact date of death, although he did initially doubt the resurrection and he famously needed to touch the wounds on Jesus' hands. He went on to fulfill the Great Commission quite well. His place of death was all the way in India. You can see a painting here of him being killed with a spear. And of course, the fact that nearly every single one of the apostles died a violent death while trying to spread the word of God goes as evidence for a lot of people to believe that the apostles were not lying. They took it seriously when they said that Jesus Christ, who they saw crucified, died on a cross, buried for 3 days, really did rise again from the grave, really did come back from death, blood and all, and once again walked among the living. December 21st, 1237 AD. This picture is Batu Khan, grandson of the famous Chengiz Khan, and on this day he and his army sacked the city of Ryazan in present-day Russia. The Mongols of the Golden Horde were moving east into Europe. After that first generation of Mongol conquerors died off, the empire didn't just stay one empire. It splintered and fragmented with a lot of different Mongol leaders, going on to govern and administer various territories that they conquered, often establishing new hereditary monarchies. Batu Khan was one of these, while he had cousins in the east who were establishing a brand new Chinese imperial dynasty. Batu was conquering in the west and establishing his kingship over Eastern Europe and the Kievan Rus. It would not be until the late 15th century with Ivan the Great when Russia would come out from under Mongol leadership. December 21st, 1361, the Battle of Lenuesa. This was one of the wars of the Reconquista, that is a period of a couple hundred years in Spain, when the Christian kingdoms of the north gradually kicked out the Muslim kingdoms of the south, but this was a relatively very minor one. It started with a couple thousand troops from the Emirate of Granada, going out to loot, pillage, and take slaves in land that wasn't theirs, and local forces combined with the army of the Kingdom of Castile came in and showed them what's what. December 21st, 1608, this was the date of death for William Davison. He was a longtime secretary for Queen Elizabeth I of England, who you can see here. His political downfall came with the 1587 execution of Mary Queen of Scots. When Queen Elizabeth got the news of the execution, she did not like that, because allegedly Davison had disobeyed an order that she gave regarding the delivery of the execution warrant. Queen Lizzie's instructions, however, arrived late, so he never got them. Nevertheless, he was imprisoned over that, and it took some pulling of strings from some influential people he had connections with to get him out. He then went on to outlive this event by a good 2 decades. December 21st, 1620, the picture you see is William Bradford of the Mayflower, and on this day he and the rest of the Mayflower Pilgrims landed near what is now known as Plymouth Rock, and established Plymouth Colony, one of the first English colonies in North America. This would be the first of many colonial locations that would eventually join together and form the United States. December 21st, 1824, this is the date of death for James Parkinson. He was a surgeon and apothecary from London. 3 guesses what he is famous for. That's right, he is the one that Parkinson's disease is named after. He is the medical professional who studied and provided the first clinical description of this disease. He was born and died in the same city, London. He died at the age of 69. December 21st, 1826, this photograph is Hayden Edwards, and on this date he became the leader of a rebellion in Texas against the Mexican government, which at the time had control of Texas. This was the Fredonian Rebellion. This was not the Texas War for Independence. He would successfully put down this rebellion in under 2 months. But this would not be the last rebellion, because what Mexico did not do was address the actual root cause, which was a large group of people who did not fit the demographics, culture, or language of the surrounding nation. And who would have thought that would be a problem? Until 10 years later that Texas actually fought their revolution and won to successfully get independence. Then they would not join the United States until another 9 years after that. Which, by the way, only gave them 15 years in the Union before the whole Civil War thing kicked off. So that's a bit of a crisis of identity. December 21st, 1832, the Battle of Konya. This was part of the Egypt-Ottoman War of the 1830s, fought in a place called Konya, which is now in central Turkey. The battle started off a little rough for the Egyptians. They did bring a smaller army to the fight, but they did have the more disciplined army, and they had a stroke of luck. Late at night, the Ottoman commander was inspecting his army. It was foggy, it was nighttime, so of course low visibility. He mistook an Egyptian unit for an Ottoman unit and rode his horse right up to the middle of them, where he was then taken prisoner. When the news spread, some of the mercenaries that the Ottoman Empire brought to the fight disbanded, and the Ottoman army of course suffered a morale drop for the rest of the battle. December 21st, 1919. The photograph you see here is Anna Goldman. She was a Russian-born anarchist. She played a significant role in the spreading of leftist ideology through America and Europe around that time. As many problems as we have with communists today, about 100 or 110 years ago, they used to be worse. That was their heyday. We used to see violent worker strikes that turned into shootouts much more often than we would imagine. And somewhere in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance and the temperance movement, we saw people like this trying to convince everybody that anarchism is a good thing and we should overthrow the government. Well, the US government did not like that, and on this day in 1919, she was deported back to Russia. A nation which, by the way, had recently at the time gone through their own leftist revolution. Two of them, as a matter of fact, and then they quickly transitioned into an economy that relied disproportionately on forced prison labor. 21st, 1923, the Nepal-Britain Treaty of 1923. This was the first treaty of friendship between Nepal and Great Britain. In fact, it was the first official British recognition of the sovereignty of Nepal, coming conspicuously soon after the formation of the League of Nations. This also superseded a different treaty that at the time was around 100 years old. The other treaty is an acknowledgement of borders. This is significant because, as you may recall, the British at the time had a pretty long history in India. And in fact, India was still a British possession at the time of this treaty, so this mark of diplomacy was very relevant to the time and place. December 21st, 1933, this is the date of death for Knud Rasmussen. He was an Arctic explorer considered the father of Eskimology, otherwise known as the study of Greenland. One of his claims to fame is being the first European to cross the Northwest Passage via dog sled. A man who lived a life worthy of a Jules Verne novel. December 21st, 1940, this is the date of death for the old sport himself, F. Scott Fitzgerald, a person whose books many a high school student has been forced to read. Little known factoid, his full name is Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. Yeah, I would abbreviate that too. Named after Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the American national anthem. It was actually super common in the 19th century to name kids after historical figures. You would be surprised how many people were named George Washington, last name, and then Benjamin Franklin, last name, etc. But then, a little while after Fitzgerald's time, that fell out of practice. Fitzgerald actually died in Los Angeles at the age of 44 of a heart. December 21st, 1941, the Thai-Japanese Pact of Alliance. At first glance, you might think this means that Thailand was a willing participant with the Japanese in the East Asian theater of World War II. Not completely. The Japanese notoriously attacked and invaded a huge number of places all over the Pacific all at once immediately after Pearl Harbor. Thailand was one of those places, and this country fell to Japanese occupation pretty quick. Rather than thinking of this as a mutual defense agreement between two nations on equal footing, it might be more accurate to think of this as terms of Thailand surrendering to the Japanese. December 21st, 1945, this is the date of death for American General George S. Patton. Very famous for being one of the biggest generals in World War II, commanded American forces in the Mediterranean, also had a big hand in D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. Patton died at the age of 60, and he died within a year of the war ending. After victory in Europe, he really wanted to get involved in the Pacific theater. However, he was not able to do so, and was instead placed in an administrative role in occupied Germany. Over the following few months, he would have some controversy regarding his views on denazification of Germany. Eisenhower and most of the American media did not take a kind view to the way that he wanted to go about it. Finally, in December, someone invited him on a pheasant hunting trip to lift his spirits, because all the drama had him in a bad state of mind. On their way to that hunting trip on December 9th, they had a car crash. Patton hit his head and died 12 days later of his injuries. December 21st, 1963, Bloody Christmas. At various points in time throughout all of human history, the island of Cyprus has been under Turkish control. People of Greek ethnicity, especially those living on the island, super duper did not like this. points in time in human history, the island of Cyprus has been under Greek control. People of Turkish ethnicity, especially those living on the island, super duper did not like this. It's just one of those places that's been a common place of conflict for centuries. And the rivalry between Greeks and Turks, as conflicts go, is one for the ages. The violence that started on the island of Cyprus on this day amounted to an entire unofficial civil war. It lasted pretty much up until the new year, and the Turks absolutely got the worst of it. Tens of thousands of displaced people. The government of Cyprus got a lot less Turkish after this. December 21st, 1968. Before we landed on the moon, we orbited the moon. This is the day that the Apollo 8 mission launched. This was a manned space mission. It was the first time humans got as far away from Earth as the moon. Apollo 11 would be the first one to land on the moon 8 months later. But Apollo 8 did give us this pretty neat photograph, Earthrise, taken from the spacecraft. December 21st, 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Bankruptcy comes at first very slowly and then very quickly. So it was in the case of the USSR. The collapse of this national system was a long time in the making, but when various Eastern European nations started ousting their communist leaders in the late 80s, it became a domino effect that the Russian Soviets could not get a grasp on. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia and a bunch of other East European nations had to grapple with the question of how to restructure their system and where do we go from here. December 21st, 1998, this is the date of death for Ernst Gunther Schenk. He was a medical doctor and member of the SS in Nazi Germany. He had seen Mr. Adolf Hitler firsthand towards the end of the war, and things that he wrote about meeting Hitler were widely cited in studying the closing days of the man's life. Or alleged closing days of the man's life, at the very least closing days of the war. December 21st, 1999. In Spain, law enforcement intercepts a van filled with explosives. Those explosives were intended to blow up Torre Picasso in Madrid. That is a skyscraper in Madrid, Picasso Tower in English. Of course named after the artist Pablo Picasso. This was done by a terrorist group that wanted independence for a Basque nation from Spain. This came 6 years after the first World Trade Center bombing, and just 2 years, of course, before 9/11. December 21st, 2012. Do you remember the 2012 phenomenon? Yes, this was going to be the end of the world. This is because Mayan civilization made a calendar that kept date thousands of years into the future from their perspective. Well, thousands of years into the future just happened to land on this date. And lots of people joked, some seriously believed, that this would be the end of the world. It has to be true, some ancient Mayans predicted it. They even made a pretty popular movie at the time about this, but the movie itself was dwarfed by the end of the world hype. Well, as of December 22nd, 2012, we can all be assured that this particular doomsday prophecy would not come true. Doomsday prophecies do come a dime a dozen. However, this one, given its size, the amount of attention it got in pop culture, this one was special. December 21st, 2013, this is the date of death for John Eisenhower, son of the famous World War II general and later President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. John became a military historian and contributed a lot to public knowledge of the U.S. military. He also served in government and diplomatic roles. He was ambassador to Belgium under President Nixon. He died at the age of 91 in Maryland. December 21st, 2017. This is the date of death for Bruce McCandless II. He is an astronaut ranked up a total of over 13 days in space, and his most well-known achievement is completing the first ever untethered spacewalk. Something not thought about often enough is astronauts are so often hyper-qualified individuals. This guy was a naval officer, aviator, and electrical engineer. Wide range of skill sets, all of them absolutely necessary. Deep technical knowledge needed for that job because if you're all the way up in space and something goes wrong, no one can quickly or easily come and help you. You're on your own. You need to figure it out. And also, a lot of astronauts have a military background, because peak physical fitness is very important for that job, considering what low gravity does to muscles.